Custodes, materia, that was the Latin for guards and material, respectively, and there came a flash of memory as to where he had seen that word, guards, before in connection with this dreadful mystery. It was, of course, in the recent letter to Dr. Allen, purporting to be from old Edward Hutchinson, and the phrase had read, "There was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in case of trouble." As you too well know, what did this signify? But wait, there was not still another reference to guards in this matter, which had failed wholly to recall when reading the Hutchinson letter. Back in the old non-secretive days, Ward had told him of the Eleazar Smith diary, recording the spying of Smith and Whedon on the Kerwin farm, and in the dreadful chronicle there had been a mention of conversations overheard before the old wizard betook himself wholly beneath the earth. There had been, Smith and Whedon insisted, terrible colloquies, wherein figured Kerwin, certain captives of his, and the guards of those captives. Those guards, according to Hutchinson, or his avatar, had eaten their heads off, and so that now Dr. Allen did not keep them in shape, and if not in shape, how save the salts, to which it appears this wizard band was engaged in reducing as many human bodies or skeletons as they could, so that it was what these Lachaithoi contained, the monstrous fruit of unhallowed rites and deeds, presumably won or cowed to such submission as to help when called up by some hellish incantation. In the defense of their blasphemous master are the questioning of those who were not so willing. Willette shuddered at the thought of what he had been pouring in and out of his hands, and for a moment felt an impulse to flee in panic from that cavern of hideous shelves, with their silent and perhaps watching sentinels. Then he thought of the materia in the myriad Phalaron jugs. On the other side of the room, salts too, and if not the salts of guards, then the salts of what? God, could it have been possible that here lay the mortal relics of half the Titan thinkers of all ages, snatched by supreme ghouls from crypts where the world thought them safe, and subject to the beck and call of madmen who sought to drain their knowledge for some still wilder end, whose ultimate effect would concern, as poor Charles had hinted in his frantic note, all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe. And Marinus Bicknell Willett had sifted their dust through his hands. Then he noticed a small door at the further end of the room, and calmed himself enough to approach it and examine the crude sign chiseled above. It was only a symbol, but it filled him with vague spiritual dread, for a morbid, dreaming fiend of his had once drawn it on paper and told him a few of the things it means in the dark abyss of sleep. It was a sign of Koth, a dream of sea fixed above the archway of a certain black tower, standing alone in twilight, and Willette did not like what his friend Randolph Carter had said of its powers. But a moment later he forgot the sign, as he recognized a new acrid odor in the stench-filled air. This was a chemical rather than the animal smell. It came clearly from the room beyond the door, and it was unmistakably the same odor which had saturated Charles Ward's clothing on the day the doctors had taken him away. So it was here that the youth had been interrupted by the final summons. He was wiser than old Joseph Curwen, for he had not resisted. Willett, boldly determined to penetrate every wonder and nightmare this nether realm might contain, seized the small lamp and crossed the threshold. A wave of nameless fright rolled out to meet him, but he yielded to no whim and deferred to no intuition. There was nothing alive here to harm him, and he would not be stayed in his piercing of the eldritch cloud, which engulfed his patient. The room beyond the door was of medium size and had no furniture save a table, a single chair, and two groups of curious machines, with clamps and wheels which Willett recognized after a moment as medieval instruments of torture. On one side of the door stood a rack of savage whips, above which were some shelves bearing empty rows of shallow, pedestaled cups of lead shaped like Grecian calices. Kulikas? I don't know what the actual Greek is. People kind of render into Latin and doesn't always have the Greek pronunciation. On the other side of it was the table, with a powerful argon lamp, a pad and pencil, and two of the stopped lacaithoi from the shelves outside, set down at irregular places, as if temporarily or in haste. Willett lighted the lamp and looked carefully at the pad to see what notes young Ward might have been jotting down when interrupted, but found nothing more intelligible than the following disjointed fragments in that crabbed Curwen geography, which shed no light on the case as a whole, but did not escape into the walls and found place below. Saw old sage and ye Sabaoth, and learnt ye way, raised Yog Sothoth thrice, and was ye next day delivered. F sought to wipe out, all knowing how to raise those from outside. As a strong argand blaze lit up the entire chamber, the doctor saw that the wall opposed to the door, between the two groups of torturing appliances in the corners, was covered with pegs from which hung a set of shapeless-looking robes of a rather dismal yellowish white. But far more interesting were the two vacant walls, both of which were thickly covered with mystic symbols and formulae roughly chiseled in the smooth dressed stone. The damp floor also bore marks of carving, and with but little difficulty Willett deciphered a huge pentagram in the center, with a plain circle about 3 feet wide halfway between this and each corner. In one of these 4 circles, near where a yellowish robe had been flung carelessly down, there stood a shallow calyx of the sort found on the shelves above the whip rack, and just outside the periphery was one of the Phaleron jugs from the shelves in the other room, its tag numbered 111. This was unstoppered and proved upon inspection to be empty. When the explorer saw with a shiver that the calyx was not within its shallow area, and save from scattering only by the absence of wind in the sequestered cavern, lay a small amount of dry, dull, greenish, efflorescent powder, which must have belonged in the jug, and Willett almost reeled at the implication that came sweeping over him as he correlated, little by little, the several elements and antecedents of the scene: the whips and the instruments of torture, the dust or salts from the jug of materia, the 2 lacaithoi from the custodes shelf, the robes, the formulae on the walls, the notes on the pad, the hints from letters and legends, and the 1,000 glimpses, doubts, and suppositions which had come to torment the friends and parents of Charles Ward. All these engulfed the doctor in a trial wave of horror as he looked at that dry greenish powder outspread in the pedestaled leaden calyx on the floor. With an effort, however, Willett pulled himself together and began studying the formula chiseled on the walls. From the stain and encrusted letters, it was obvious that they were carved in Joseph Curwen's time, and their text was such to be vaguely familiar to one who had read much Curwen material or delved extensively into the history of magic. One the doctor clearly recognized as what Mrs. Ward heard her son chanting on that noxious Good Friday a year before, and what an authority had told him was a very terrible invocation addressed to secret entities outside the normal spheres. It was not spelled here exactly as Mrs. Ward had set it down from memory, nor as yet the authority had shown it to him in the forbidden pages of Eliphas Levi, but its secret identity was unmistakable in such words as Sebaoth, Metraton, Almonsin, and Zariatnatmik, sent a shudder of fright through the searcher who had seen and felt so much of cosmic abomination just around the corner. There was a left-hand wall as one entered the room. The right-hand wall was no less thickly inscribed, and Willett felt a sort of recognition as he came upon the pair of formulae so frequently occurring in the recent notes in the library. They were, roughly speaking, the same, with the ancient symbols of Dragon's Head and Dragon's Tail heading them as in Ward's scribblings, but the spelling differed quite wildly from that of the modern versions, as if old Curwen had a different way of recording sound, or as if later study had evolved more powerful and perfected variants of the invocations in question. I try to figure that part out. I do a little bit of both. If I notice that something might cause mispronunciation, I use a different transliteration. The doctor tried to reconcile the chiseled version with the one that still ran persistently in his head, and found it hard to do, where the script he had memorized began, A Nug Nagah Yag Sothoth. This epigraph started out as A Kangenga Yage Sathaha. A Kangenga Yage Sothotha, which to his mind would seriously interfere with the simplification of the second word. Ground, as the latter text was, into his consciousness, the discrepancy disturbed him, and he found himself chanting the first of the formula aloud in effort to square the sound he conceived with the letters he found carved. Weird and menacing in that abyss of antique blasphemy rang his voice, its accents keyed to a droning sing-song, either through the spell of the past and the unknown, or through the hellish example of that dull, so-called godless wail from the pits, whose inhuman coldness rose and fell rhythmically in the distance through the stench and the darkness. A Nug Nagah Yag Sothoth. E L Gem F A Thradog Ooh-ah. But what was that cold wind which had sprung to life at the very outset of the chant? The lamps were sputtering woefully, and the gloom grew so dense that the letters on the wall nearly faded from sight. There was smoke, too, and an acrid odor which quite drowned out the stench from the faraway wells. An odor like that he had smelt before, yet indefinitely stronger and more pungent. He turned from the inscriptions to face the room with its bizarre contents, and saw the calyx on the floor, in which the ominous, efflorescent powder had lain, was giving forth a cloud of thick greenish-black vapor of surprising volume and opacity. That powder, great, it had come from the shelf of materia. What it was doing now, and what had started it, the formula he had been chanting, the first of a pair, dragon's head, ascending node. Blessed could it be? The doctor reeled, and through his head raced wildly disjointed scraps from all he had seen, heard, and read of the frightful case of Joseph Kerwin and Dr. Charles Dexter Ward. I say to you again, do not call up any that you could not put down. Have ye words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. Mercy of heaven, what is that shape behind the parting smoke? Now, it's essential, whether it's, sanctioned by religion formula or not, to guard your intention and consciousness when you're going over spiritual formula.